Morning, ladies and gentlemen, and once again, welcome to this very special segment on the 10th of January 2022. Well, sorry for the bit of a delay in starting because we're still waiting for the Prime Minister's live feed to be connected. But anyway, we will begin and we will bring that as promised just very soon. Well, right now, let's take a look at what's going to happen right here in Queensland. And we are projected, as I mentioned before, that we are projected to reach our peak towards the end of this month and early February. And there's a lot of uncertainty out there in the community, and people are very, very afraid about what's happening. People are getting a little bit uptight when people get in lifts, when there's 2 or 3 or more people. And of course, when we have all been asked to go get the testing done, many people want to do the right thing, but you try and get a test done, that becomes very, very hard. And people who are using the RIT, the rapid antigen testing at home, have now been asked to register that with the government. How many people will do that is just something that remains to be seen. And of course, all those centers where testings are being done, they're overwhelmed. They're turning back people. And of course, in many of the places, the queues are very, very long. So anyway, let's join our Premier and see what updates he has for us.
Today we have 18,000 new cases. Now 4,320 of those are basically people who have registered, who have detected a positive RAT test at home. You would have seen big numbers in Victoria for exactly the same reason the other day. We now have 80,563 active cases. 402 people are in hospital, 22 in ICU, 5 ventilated. The Chief Health Officer will talk a little bit more detail about those. 37,951 tests were done in the last 24 hours, and our vaccine coverage is 91.10%, at least 1 dose, and 87.67% are fully vaccinated. Boosters are 695,575. That's Queensland and Commonwealth data together. So that's 45% of eligible persons are getting boosted. So if you are due for your booster, please come forward and get that. We've had roughly 230,000 rapid antigen tests have been deployed to our clinics so far. So that's great to see that constant stream of the rapid antigen tests are coming in. And of course, tomorrow, in good news, our vaccines kick off for our 5 to 11-year-olds. So if you have a primary school age student between 5 and 11, please go onto the Queensland Health website and book your child in for a vaccine, or go to your local GP or go to your local pharmacy. There are a range of places you can get your children vaccinated. I want to talk to you about the school year, and let me explain to you very clearly why we have made these decisions that we are taking today. The projections are at the moment, and modelling can change, but the projections are at the moment that New South Wales and Victoria will reach their peaks before Queensland. Queensland is expected to reach their peak during the last week of January and the first week of February. Therefore, it is not desirable to have our children back starting school during the peak of this wave. So the decisions that we have taken today will enable children to still get their full learning, but it will mean that parents can be confident that their children will not be going to school during the peak of this wave. So we will be starting the school year. It will be moving from Monday, January 24th to Monday, February the 7th. This is a delay, but it is a necessary delay because of the wave that Queensland will be experiencing. Now, our Year 11s and 12s, we know that this is a very important time for them, so they will commence remote learning from Monday the 31st of January. So for that week, they will start commencing remote learning. Then what we will be doing is we will be extending, not for the Year 11s and 12s when they finish, but for the remaining school cohort, there will be an extra week of school at the end of the year in December, which means that school will end not on Friday the 9th of December, but it will end on Friday, December the 16th. And as I said to you, this is because we are expecting the peak of this wave during this particular point in time, the end of January, early February. Now, our schools will be open for vulnerable children and children of essential workers, as we previously have put in place during COVID, because it is absolutely critical that during this time that our men and women who are working in critical industries can still go to work. And remember, during the start of this pandemic, this is exactly the processes we put in place. So this is going to be a tough time of year for a lot of people, and I thank them for their patience and their understanding of the decisions that we have had to take in the best interests of the community. Also too, it allows more time for the children to be vaccinated as well. And as I said, please book your child to get vaccinated. It is not mandatory, but you'll hear from the Chief Health Officer, we are encouraging our children to be vaccinated.
We're still having problem connecting with Canberra. We will soon, we've been told. Well, right now, as the school situation here in Queensland, I think it makes sense, delaying the beginning and then adding another week on towards the end of the term. That does make sense, so that it does not take away from the teaching time or the learning time period for the students. So that does make sense, because right at this point in time, as I mentioned before, it looking out here, everything looks a little bit glim, and it's not what it usually is to be. It's not the vibrant. As today, the 10th, is when a lot of businesses, I know slowly after the end of year break they all start coming back, but today I think the majority of the businesses would be open from today onward. So everyone was looking forward to coming back to work, but many have been asked to stay at home while testings are done, while people are waiting for results, and of course these are the rules. We have to do what we have to do. We have to follow those rules. But we know that asymptomatic people are asked to isolate, but what's going to happen if you are a food distributor? You've got an exemption.
The other change we made today from New South Wales Health is an exemption for close contacts in essential food distribution networks. We had a similar approach during the lockdown period in relation to essential workers, and what that will mean if you are deemed by your employer in an essential food distribution network or manufacturing, that through the provision of a rapid antigen test on advice of your employer, you'll be able to return to work if you are asymptomatic. So that change comes in effective immediately today. Those orders were signed off this morning, and we believe that will ease the pressure on supply and distribution networks, particularly for those essential areas across our state as we move through the next few weeks.
So moving through the next few weeks is going to be challenging, as we know, with the opening up of the borders and, of course, releasing the pressure of all the things. What has happened, the numbers are just, exploded, and no one's been prepared. None of the states or even federal, which we will hear from our Prime Minister very soon, that none of the preparations that were put in place is below standard. Of course, you can see this press conferences, but if you just follow the commentary that goes on the side, you can see the sentiment of people, what everyone's saying, what they are feeling, that whole of this thing could have been better managed. Of course, no one knew about Omicron coming. Now, talking about vaccines, I'm just waiting to get my booster, and many people would be in that situation. And having had the 2 double vaxxed, we were all very, proudly displaying our thing that I am double vaxxed. But here we are now, we're waiting for the booster. But also, the vaccine itself, in some countries, it's very challenging. We are fortunate here in Australia, but once again, how strong, how well, where has this vaccine been made? As we just find out from our next report, that in Indonesia, they relied on Chinese-made vaccine only to find out it's not working.
In a primary school in the outskirts of Jakarta, these children are forming the next line of defence in Indonesia's battle against COVID. Mother Sri Wahuni says it was an easy choice to bring her 7-year-old daughter along.
It's a government program, and I think the vaccine will help my child build her immunity.
Indonesia is using Chinese-produced Sinovac to vaccinate children between the ages of 6 and 11 because currently it's the only vaccine they've approved for kids.
We're doing more studies, including Pfizer. Once the result is out, we can use Pfizer as well as an alternative to vaccinate children.
For a while, Chinese vaccines were popular across Asia, with more than 30 nations either buying jabs or receiving donated shots. But as evidence mounted they weren't as effective, many countries switched to Western-made. But there are still millions of people who have been vaccinated by Chinese vaccines in the region, and they're vulnerable to the Omicron variant.
If we just look at the levels of this neutralizing antibody, they appear to be on the lower side to begin with and required boosting even before Omicron.
Some countries, like South Korea and Japan, have reverted to more draconian measures, closing borders, reintroducing curfews to keep Omicron at bay. But even still, cases are multiplying at a worrying rate. So far, there's only been a handful of locally transmitted Omicron cases reported in Indonesia, but it's likely to be circulating in much higher numbers. Testing rates are low here. PCR tests cost about $30 Australian, expensive for most Indonesians.
I think the government should provide the testing for free, like governments overseas.
The vaccination program is free, but with only about 40% of Indonesia's 270 million people fully vaccinated, it's unlikely to be enough to keep Omicron at bay. Carrington Clark, ABC News.
So they were, and right here, of course, people are having problems getting the vaccine itself right here in Australia. As you'll find from the next report is that, some parents are finding it hard and struggling to find vaccines for their kids.
The rolling hills near South Australia's McLaren Vale region are a welcome sight for Zoe Mulkern and her mum Cassie.
Come on, girls.
The 11-year-old came down with COVID-19 in mid-December. With only one bathroom in their homestead, Zoe and Cassie were told to isolate in a Medi hotel.
I felt really sad to leave the rest of my family.
Merry Christmas, Zoe.
Zoe says it was horrible and overall she's glad she'll soon be able to be inoculated.
I feel nervous to be getting a needle because I don't really like needles that much, but overall I don't really mind it because I don't want to get COVID again.
I think it's a big relief that the kids can now be vaccinated, especially going back to school.
Though getting Zoe an appointment has been tough.
We weren't able to get her in until the 29th of January. So, yeah, that's cutting it fine for getting back to school.
She's not alone. Logistical issues have already forced the cancellation of some appointments. And with schools meant to be returning from the end of the month, many parents are growing increasingly anxious their child won't be vaccinated in time or that their immunity won't have kicked in.
I think in all reasonableness, I expect there'll be some lag going into term one, but we remain optimistic and try and get through as many as possible.
Doctors say they're working as quickly as they can and remind those who are hesitant that this vaccination is important for the whole community. In the United States, at least 8.7 million doses have been administered in 5 to 11-year-olds so far. According to the country's Centre for Disease Control, the most common side effects were an arm ache at the site of the injection, headache and fatigue.
And there have been no deaths. So this is extremely safe for children, and that's fantastic news and should be really reassuring to parents.
Work is also underway here for a national framework to help guide schools and families back to the classroom.
Senior.
That's something Zoe is looking forward to.
And that's a good report. There's something that Zoe is looking forward to, but getting those results and getting the time or appointments for the testing is very, very hard as well. Of course, one of the other things that we covered last week was the shortage of workers in in many areas. Especially heartfelt is the regional areas, and the regional areas, they rely on migrant workers as well. But the challenge there is getting their visa, and it is very hard and very challenging to arrange visas for migrant workers.
Mohsen Ali's been working at Coober Pedy biggest supermarket for half a decade. But the whole time he's been in limbo, unsure if the authorities will approve a visa to let him stay.
They refused the nomination on the basis that their business really doesn't need an office manager, which is, I would say, it's very shocking news, because I replace the guy who got the sponsorship in the same position.
His boss Penelope Carter sponsored his application, which was rejected. Mr Ali's since appealed.
For 5 years he's been continuing to fight red tape after red tape, decisions that shouldn't have been made the way that they were. And then the previous person before him had like a successful outcome in a matter of weeks. So it's emotionally really difficult to support him through that.
The visa uncertainty only makes it harder to attract workers to the remote town, and that affects business.
There's just certain things that we're unable to provide or expand due to the fact that we can't source staff that are wanting to come and live in Coober Pedy permanently.
More permanent residents would also improve the town's prosperity.
For a lot of remote regional areas, having people that are willing to live in these areas and be a part of the community, send their kids to school and be a part of the community here, it's really imperative that we are able to make it easier for them to do that.
Migration agent Mark Glasbrook says the Opal City isn't alone, and the problems stem from a 2017 change to Australia's migration strategy, refocusing on migrants who can earn higher incomes.
The Productivity Commission report found that people that earn more money make a greater lifetime tax contribution to the economy. A number of regional migration programs were removed. A lot of those programs had lower wage outcomes.
Government data shows despite some temporary skill shortage visas being maintained, the number granted for smaller jurisdictions like SA, Tasmania, the NT and the ACT fell last year, while they jumped everywhere else.
The settings of those programs are so hard for applicants and businesses to meet that those programs, they might as well not even exist.
Independent modelling from BDO Econ Search shows filling job vacancies with migrants would boost regional economies.
It's more of a shared benefit between the applicant who gets the visa, the employer who gets a worker, and the regional community who gets another person living, working, contributing to the local economy. A lot of people say that migrants are job takers, but quite clearly they're job creators. And having people living and working in regional South Australia will create more jobs in Adelaide for locals to be employed in and trained in. So it's a win-win.
But the Commonwealth says migration settings are fine as they are, with a dedicated regional visa category and a new skilled regional work category introduced in 2019.
As I've been living here for more than 5 years, I really love living here. First, so I just want to be part of the community. The people are so friendly, you know.
A labour of love. Gabriella Marchant, ABC.
A labour of love, and of course, there you go. As we sometimes cover, we had that show on Friday with Suman Dua of Migration Updates, where we find out about these regional settings as well. So looking at that, it would be a win-win situation for everyone. But of course, rules are rules and laws are laws. Right now, we'll go to Western Australia and looking at the blue paw that has always been a bit of an issue with the kangaroos.
When Kings Park's chief plant breeder Digby Grounds walked into this hothouse 9 years ago, he was floored by what he saw.
I walked around the corner and it was there, and I was just, astonished, amazed.
His own colleagues were just as dubious about the blue kangaroo paw.
Then Have you dyed that? Or, what have you done? You're playing a trick on us.
Kings Park has been breeding native flora since the 1970s to be hardier, disease-resistant and more attractive. In fact, many of the West Australian natives in gardens around the country were developed here. Digby, why is blue so exciting?
Well, blue doesn't exist in nature in kangaroo paws, so to have it growing in a pot that's blue is quite amazing.
The breeding program started in 2007, but it wasn't until 2012 that the first blue flower emerged.
And the first blue was actually serendipitous. We were combining different colours of different species to breed disease tolerance into them. And it was just by combining some novel colours that the blue came through.
Less than 10% of the flowers in nature
companies. Are you looking at giving free rat tests to those companies?
I'm going to do the consultation first with them before prejudging any actions that they may require. Many of them are doing that already and accessing supplies, but that's something I'm looking forward to the advice to come back through from Minister Andrews and Minister Robert. On the other issue, just remind me.
Oh, the workers travelling from state to state.
Look, I anticipate, given the paper that we've been able to have agreed by all the states and territories' chief health officers, that will see agreement occur between all the jurisdictions. And I think that's very important because you're right, and you've got people working in food production, food processing, food distribution that does move across borders. Now, a really good example of that cooperation was last week when we abolished the 7-day rolling testing for truck drivers. Now, that had been something we'd put in place. And now, if that had not been done and agreed by everyone, bar WA, which has a different set of circumstances, then that obviously would have been very problematic. But premiers were very, very quick and very practical about that. And I'd expect a similar response here. Okay, thank you very much, everyone.
So we'll leave that report there at that point, and we might be coming back to it in a minute as well. But right now we will move on and look at, trailblazer, Sidney Poitier. Who remembers him? We all remember him fondly. Unfortunately, is no more.
Gentlemen, right here, please. Trailblazer, role model. Sidney Poitier broke down barriers with poise, dignity and pride.
But, Mummy, you haven't even looked at it.
But behind it, there was a lot of hard work, not least navigating a white-dominated world, all the way to the top of his profession.
See him in the garden.
Making history when he won the 1964 Academy Award for Best Actor for Lilies of the Field.
The winner is Sidney Poitier.
The winner is choked with emotion.
It is a long journey to this moment.
As an actor and later as a filmmaker, Poitier brought depth and nuance to his on-screen characters.
Maybe I'll get down on my black knees. All right, Mr. Charlie. All right, Mr. Great White Father. You just give us that money.
Not afraid to tackle racial issues head-on.
I love your daughter. There is nothing I wouldn't do to try to keep her as happy as she was the day I met her.
A patch of blue.
Just as I thought.
What?
Now you're a very pretty girl.
Pretty.
And later, Poitier's role in To Sir With Love were among many that redefined how audiences viewed black characters.
You will call me.
Family of the 22-year-old man who was killed during the course of those floods, and also we continue to hold out hope and prayers for the young girl, 14-year-old girl, who was washed away in the floods, and our thoughts are with her family as well. I have a daughter who's 14 years old, so I can understand the terrible time that family must be going through at the moment. I want to thank all of those who are engaged in the rescue and search work up there in Queensland at the moment. It was quite a deluge, as we know. The floodwaters peaked in Maryborough last night at 10 metres. That's a little less, I understand, than back in 2013, but that's a very serious flood. An evacuation order was put in place for the CBD area. Homes were obviously affected, as was parts of the CBD. There is a evacuation centre that has been established at the Brolga Theatre. There was around 25 people there. The last advice I had on that, CONDIS plan was activated by the head of emergency management yesterday. What that enables is all the disaster arrangements and requests being facilitated through the Commonwealth, through the Emergency Management Authority. I've directed the Commissioner of the National Recovery and Resilience Agency, who was in Queensland at the time, to be there in that area and to be liaising with officials in Queensland. I want to thank the Queensland Premier. We were in contact yesterday. The capacity of the Queensland Government, and particularly local authorities, and I want to thank the local mayors and local government areas in that region who've been doing an excellent job. They're, of course, used to floods in that part of Australia at this time of year especially, and they've been doing an excellent job, and there's been no request for federal resources to support any response or recovery effort. That is well in hand with those local authorities. But you would have seen this morning that Minister McKenzie has announced that the Commonwealth disaster payments, which are $1,000 for adults and $400 for children, have been activated. You'll be able to get those online or by ringing up tomorrow at 9 a.m. and get those payments if you're in the Gympie, Bundaberg or Fraser Coast areas, as defined. That is the same area that the Queensland Government has been working on in terms of any DRFA assistance that's necessary. There's also the disaster recovery allowance for those who've had income impacted, which is a payment for up to 13 weeks at the job seeker rate, and that will also be available from tomorrow morning to be able to access that. The weather system, which is now linked to Tropical Cyclone Tiffany, it's currently at a Category 2. It's due to make landfall between Cooktown and the Lockhart River today, so an area that is obviously a lot less populated than the areas that we've seen affected by the floods to date, but nonetheless I know Queensland authorities will be watching that closely and the Commonwealth will be available to assist. I particularly want to thank, in addition to the Premier, to Lou O'Brien and Keith Pitt, who are our local members in that area, who have been working closely with local authorities, and I've been staying in touch with both of them for the work on the ground, and they have two messages. First of all, if it's flooded, forget it. I cannot stress this enough. This is a season that we're anticipating floods, and wherever they might be, wherever they might strike next, if it is flooded, forget it, please. And the other message is to thank all of those who've worked so hard on the ground to support people, those who are in the evacuation centres as we speak. So we'll continue to monitor those situations. I was here yesterday working through that with Joe Buffoni, the Head of Emergency Management Australia. On the issues of the virus and Omicron, I'll ask the Chief Medical Officer to speak further to this, as well as the General Fruin. Omicron is a gear change, and we have to push through. That's what Omicron is about. We're dealing with serious volumes of cases, but we are not seeing the same impact proportionally from previous variants in terms of the impact on hospitalisations, ICU and ventilated patients. There are 5,097 patients in hospital who have COVID. That does not mean they went to hospital because of COVID. It meant they're in hospital and they have COVID. As we outlined a week or so ago, up to half or thereabouts of those patients who are being admitted for other reasons and have COVID. That still means they have to be treated in hospital as a COVID patient. But that is not the reason they went to hospital. We're also seeing that, as the CMO advised us yesterday, in ICU numbers as well. So people who are in ICU haven't gone into ICU because of COVID, they're in ICU for other reasons and they have COVID. So it's important to have that qualification around those numbers. There are 78 patients who are on ventilators, which is well within the capacity. The major stresses on the hospital system relate to workforce issues, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But of course, today, living with COVID means continuing to ensure we press ahead with the vaccination program. And the children's vaccine commences today. We have contracted 3.3 million vaccines. There are over 2 million of those which are already in the country. The balance will be here within a week. There are 2.3 million children in those age groups of 5 to 11. There are 6,000 places where people can go and get those children's vaccines. There are 835,000 vaccines in those places right now as of last Friday, and more would have been added to that since last Friday. So the aim here is to have as many of the places where you can go and get it. So if you can't get it from where you would normally go, no, there are 5,999 and more other places where these vaccines are on the shelves. So there's 835,000 doses on those shelves, in those fridges, in those pharmacies, in those GPs and in those state hubs right now. And General Frewen can go into more detail about the breakdown of those when he speaks in a moment. 5,100 children have already had age 5 to 11 that vaccine because they are in those priority categories of a medically required earlier vaccination. I'm also pleased to note that the booster program, around 1.3 million boosters have been delivered and doses administered in the past week. We are now running at 8 times the rate for boosters that we were on the first dose of the vaccine, and now well over 2 times the second dose rate for those boosters. There's 3.65 million boosters that have now been administered around the country, and that rate is accelerating, and we expect it to accelerate more, particularly as the state hubs now come online. As you know, the GPs and pharmacies, they've all been there. They've been carrying that load, particularly over this summer period, getting those boosters done. With those larger state hubs coming back online now and over the next few weeks, we will see those numbers improve even further, and we welcome that. That is something that we've been working closely with the states and territories on through the National Cabinet process. I note also what the New South Wales Premier said this morning, another reminder. The people who are predominantly in hospital, who have gone there because of COVID, are unvaccinated. If you want to end up in hospital, being unvaccinated against this virus is the most likely way to end up there. So please take availability of those vaccines that are available to all Australians free of charge all around the country. We've also been working, as we were yesterday, on the critical supply chain issue, and the Chief Medical Officer will go into more detail on this, but the medical expert panel, the AHPPC, has endorsed a new set of arrangements that relate to workers in critical supply chains in food processing, food production and distribution, as well as emergency services. Now, as you know, some states have already moved on that as we're working together on that. I understand the Victorian Government will be making further announcements on that today. That paper is now before National Cabinet for endorsement. I was not going to wait until Thursday for that. And discussions with the Chief Medical Officer, as soon as it was endorsed, we agreed that that should immediately go to National Cabinet for endorsement. I anticipate that will happen over the course of the morning. It was sent to them earlier today, so we'll just wait for their endorsement, and that will enable them to take that up. What that involves is asymptomatic, close contacts being able to go to work in those sectors, but I'll allow the Chief Medical Officer to speak more to that. The next step is to take that further into other critical sectors, and we're especially looking at the transport sector, both in aviation and in other distribution tasks. So not customer-facing, I should note, on the food side. So if we're talking about Coles and Woolies, we're not talking about people who are working on checkouts. Anyone who's customer-facing, they are not doing that. But those who are driving the trucks to deliver the food, those who are stacking the shelves at night, those who are in the distribution centres, those who are in the abattoirs, those who are in the manufacturing places that are producing food, all of those are now caught up in those new critical supply chain rules, and we're looking to extend those to other sectors. I note some premiers have noted that they'd be keen to look at how we could apply that in the hospitality sector. We'll take that one step at a time, but for now we are very focused through the process being led by Minister Andrews on those critical supply chains and getting the workers where we need them to go. As the case numbers continue to rise, the volume of cases will of course have an inevitable impact on the workforce, and so we're looking to maximise those who can remain in the workforce, and that is why these arrangements are being put in place. But anyone who is symptomatic or has COVID, they are not going into work. And I should note that these arrangements are already in place in the aged care sector. They're already operating there as they are in the healthcare sector. Now, this is an incredibly tough time on business. There aren't lockdowns, but there are many people obviously impacted by being close contacts or people being wary, or those indeed who have COVID themselves, and that is having an impact on consumer spending. That's predictable and understandable, and that will be the case for a while yet, while Omicron works its way through and moves to its peak. But that means it is very tough on business, and so we're working to ensure that we can alleviate the impacts on business. Firstly, when it comes to any regulatory issues, and the first of those is occupational health and safety regulations. The Attorney-General is leading a process with the states and territories, which we anticipate being concluded in time for National Cabinet on Thursday, which will remove any suggestion of a requirement that small, medium-sized businesses have to be undertaking testing of their staff. There is some confusion about that. I should note, in pretty much all states, except possibly for Western Australia, there are no exposure sites anymore. And so the risk of a business becoming an exposure site is not something that they, as they were concerned about earlier in the year. That is now changed because of the definition of close contacts and the like. So working out those occupational health and safety regulations and giving small business certainty around that is very, very important. We identified this issue last week, and so that work is being done. Secondly, while large businesses in critical supply chains like Coles and Woolies and so on have the means to be able to support the arrangements that are set out in the medical expert paper about how their close contacts are managed in their centres, there are small and medium-sized businesses in the supply chain, in those critical supply chains, which won't have necessarily those resources. And yesterday I tasked Minister Robert with Minister Andrews to be working with those small businesses in those particular sectors about how we can support them more effectively together with states and territories to ensure that they can be taking up these new arrangements that are set out by the medical expert panel. We've also, the Treasurer, despite having COVID, he is still battling on. He's improving. I speak to him very regularly, and he's been speaking to the banks as well to be monitoring what the impact is on their customer base, on their small businesses. And the reports we're getting back are that while this is a tough time, and it is really tough for businesses because of the impact of COVID, that's living with COVID when there are a high number of cases is difficult. But what we are seeing is there are strong balance sheets right across the economy. And that is backed up by the data from APRA that the Treasurer has referred to today. And this is in the household sector, but we've got 45 months on average ahead of monthly mortgage repayments as of October of last year. Now that's up from 32 months. In September of last year, there was $222 billion on mortgage offset accounts, and that's up from $174 billion in March 2020. So Australians have been making good decisions to increase their financial resilience during the course of this pandemic. They're using their smarts, they're making their choices, they're ensuring they're getting their financial position is in a stronger position it can be to get through this pandemic. That's obviously been massively supported by everything from JobKeeper to Commonwealth disaster payments during the lockdowns that occurred, and these have been used well to strengthen people's resilience. And small businesses have had similar supports but they're obviously dealing with the challenge of reduced consumer activity at the moment because of the Omicron variant. Now, the final issue I was going to raise before passing on to the Chief Medical Officer is our real focus, in addition to those other critical supply areas on Thursday, is going to be on schools. The Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Secretary Gaetjens, has been working with all of the other states and territories to harmonise their back-to-school plans. Remember, as I said last week, our objective is go back, stay back, day one, term one. Now, the peak of the Omicron virus is going to be different in different states and territories. It's clearly going to peak in New South Wales and Victoria versus other states. And so states and territories will obviously work that through, and I'll ask the CMO to talk more about that. So the idea is once we go back, we stay back, and we get certainty around that issue. And so we'll be working through those issues this week and to get further certainty and harmonisation between the states and territories, and I thank all of them for working with us on that process. It's obviously a key issue for parents as they're thinking about their children going back to school in a few weeks' time, and we'll look to have those arrangements very clear by the time that occurs. And with that, I'll pass you on to the CMO. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Prime Minister, and good morning.
Thank you very much for that report. Right now, it's time to say goodbye from this segment. And don't forget that from this week, we will be starting some of our the normal specialist presenter shows, like the real estate update, back on from Wednesday. Well, until tomorrow, it's goodbye from me. Now, look, remain safe. And if you're having problems trying to get to a vaccination center or getting a testing done, please reach out. And the best thing is reach out to your GPs. GPs are able to provide, if needed, referrals. And with the referrals, you've got a little bit more options available to you as well. So, you know, I know that you all want to do the right thing, and the system is under a lot of pressure. And as Prime Minister mentioned, that lots of those tests in kits are now available. They're out there, they are in the regions, they're with the GPs, they're with the pharmacies. You just need to find out and move on. And of course, here in Queensland, as we know, we're bracing ourselves for growing numbers. So in the coming weeks, we will see numbers grow. And it will keep growing until the end of this month and probably peak towards the early February before plateauing out. So that's the prediction. What actually happens, we'll keep you updated on a daily basis. Once again, thank you very much for joining in, and we'll have the updated functions and events from tomorrow because there's a lot of functions that have taken place, many which have been postponed. So there will be a complete update where we will contact all the organizers today and get an update, and we'll bring all that to you until tomorrow. So once again, thank you very much for joining in on this 10th day of January. Yes, 10 days already into January. So until tomorrow, it's goodbye from me.